everybody. Welcome to CC World, a podcast by Global Spark where we engage in conversations with global experts about cutting-edge solutions to our world's most pressing problems using interdisciplinary problem solving, creativity, and collaboration. I'm your host and podcast co-producer, Atharv. Today, I'm very excited to be having a conversation with Kate Banting, Head of Social Impact and Marketing for Canada at the Boston Consulting Group. Kate joined the Toronto office of the Boston Consulting Group in 2005 as an associate and rejoined in 2010 after completing her MBA. Kate has experience across travel and tourism, consumer goods, retail, and financial services practice areas. In BCG, Kate has supported multiple transformations and recently focused on enabling organizations and ensuring sustained success. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kate.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to join you today.
I'm very excited too. You know, Kate, you've had such exciting academic and professional career trajectory. One thing that I'm particularly very curious about when it comes to your educational background is, even though you went to business school, you didn't do the things that people traditionally do there. You were involved in a lot of other programs like Education Pioneers and Building Educated Leaders for Life that had to do with education equity, which is not a conventional path for most business school graduates and students. So I'm curious as to what inspired you to work in this space while you were yourself a student.
Sure. So as I think about my career and what's kind of driven me, I've always been thinking about impact and where I can make the biggest impact and where I can make an impact for society and for the world and how I can use my own personal skills to drive change and to drive impact. So found that when I was graduating from undergrad, trying to figure out where I should go and what I should do, thinking about all of the different places, and I wanted to work across industries, across topics to drive change. And that's when I stumbled into management consulting and found out that actually BCG would be a great place for me to launch my career because I'd have that ability to work across a bunch of different areas, including social impact, as well as other places, and really build that skill set to be able to drive change. I always wanted to make change, didn't always know exactly where to make it. So spend about 2.5 years at BCG learning that skills and learning that skill set to be able to drive change across multiple dimensions. When I thought about the next step, I thought an MBA would be a great addition, and building an additional business school or business toolkit at business school would be a great opportunity. So I joke that someone asks, why did you go to Harvard? I got into Harvard. I feel if you get in, you go. So had an incredible opportunity to do my MBA at Harvard Business School, which was an incredible experience, but with the idea that I was going to move into the social impact space. So I was going to use that as my pivot point. I do believe business is integral into driving change, especially societal change at the micro or macro level. And so to do my best, I thought building up my skill set and then bringing that to the social impact space would be ideal. So I did. I spent my couple years at business school thinking a lot about social impact, thinking a lot about change that I could do. I was involved in all the social impact clubs at HBS. I thought about where I wanted to do, and I spent my summer working in the space. Education's always been a passion of mine, and finding a way to work on that during my summer was an incredible experience.
That is very fascinating. And one thing that particularly stood out to me was that you need to understand how to affect impact around you to actually be involved in this space, because it's such a buzzword, right? Social impact, but more often than not, we don't really know what it entails and how to go about having impact. I'm curious as to how you discovered that path and what eventually led to your return to BCG.
So it's a good question. While I was working in my summer, I learned a ton about the social impact space. Actually working with Education Pioneers was a phenomenal experience. I don't know if you're familiar with the nonprofit, but they match students and with education-related nonprofits or organizations or for-profits in the education space in the United States, primarily in cohorts though. So in 4 days a week, I spent working for a nonprofit. So I work with BEL, Building Educated Leaders for Life, an incredible after-school program in the US. But I spent 1 day a week with my cohort of similar like-minded individuals who are all learning about the education space. And each week we brought a different topic to the table and did a deep dive into what was happening in education. That forum and that community that we built really opened my eyes to some of the systemic challenges that were faced and opportunities, as well as what is working and what's not working, which I carried with me. So that was an incredible experience. I also learned something that's less incredible in that many, even high performing nonprofits, struggle with a lot of things. And one thing that I noticed folks were struggling with was strong leadership and really managing people and getting the most out of every employee. And to me, this was a critical thing of how are we going to unlock the potential of each individual, and how do we make sure that our businesses, our organizations, our nonprofits are fulfilling all of that. So I thought, well, when I go into one of these organizations, I want to be able to lead, and I want to enable everybody, and I want to learn how to be a great manager. So I thought back, how can I learn how to be a great manager? Well, I've studied it. I'm at the Harvard Business School. I'm learning it, but I'm like, actually, I haven't managed any people. I've managed some volunteer things. I haven't managed a team for a sustained amount of time and motivated them to drive change. And I thought back of where do I see that working the best? And I thought back that my time at BCG, I saw some incredible managers, and to actually come back to BCG and learn how to be a manager here and manage a team and manage processes and outcomes and projects, that would give me the skills that I would need. So when I go into the space, I have that ability to really drive impact. But my rationale of going into the space and then coming back, and with the idea that I come back to BCG for 2 years and then make the leap into the social impact sector, which I haven't quite done.
It's amazing how much it's important for us to step outside of our bubble to realize, A, everything that the bubble has to offer that we just took for granted, and B, also to have additional perspective on what we can bring to the bubble that doesn't already exist there. And I think your detours to and from BCG are a good example of that. And one thing that really stood out to me from what you said was, being a manager is not just getting people to do work, but it's enabling them and unlocking their potential to do their best, and in this case, to have a positive impact in the communities around them. And in your career so far, you've managed to work in a rather expansive range of issues, be it youth development, mental health, diversity, community engagement, food insecurity. There's a lot of, it's a long line. Yeah. But of course, the times that we live in right now, I'm particularly intrigued by 3 of those that I think have, their effect has been most acutely noticed in these times, and that is food security, racism, and mental health. Now, one thing that I'd really like to hear from you is, what does BCG do in this respect, and how is that different from working for a nonprofit, which I'm sure it's something you have contended with at some point of time?
I have. And I'm happy to talk about what BCG does. I want to, again, emphasize that I'm talking in terms of what my experience has been, as opposed to what BCG does as a corporation. But before I jump into the specifics of what we've been able to do at the local level, I want to just talk about some of the stuff we're doing at the global level. And BCG has done a really impactful pivot in recent years to really focus on bringing social impact not only to the nonprofit sector, but to the for-profit sector. And where we have our great relationships with corporations around the world, and the largest corporations, how we're enabling them to do what's right. And 50% of our largest clients, we've been able to do social impact work with in the last couple of years to drive change. And those are the organizations that are on the ground making a big impact in the world. So it's amazing when you can use the business toolkit, the social impact toolkit, to impact corporations, our global nonprofits, and then our local nonprofits. And that's where I sit, is typically in the local nonprofits in the Canadian context. And that's kind of what you're talking about on some of the subjects that I spent my recent time thinking about. So on the recent side, we've been able to drive a significant impact by working with nonprofits. And I guess the question you asked was why do I choose to stay at BCG to drive that impact? And I think that there's a lot of reasons. One, surround myself with great people and working with BCGers every day and bringing the intellectual curiosity to the table. I find we can have a multiplier effect on the organizations that we're working on and working with, not on, the organizations we work with, to help them drive significant change. And we can see, and we can take a step back and see that macro level. When we see an issue, we can, if time permits and capacity permits, we can actually dive back. And so what we were able to do on the racism topic this fall was we wrote a report. We said, we need to better understand the data in Canada before we can dive into solutions. So let's write a report. So we were able to invest against something like that. And we were able to bring our corporate resources to the table and our financial resources to drive significant impact, as well as the stuff that we can do at the corporate level, which I think can drive significantly faster impact around the world by engaging the people who have power and money in different places to be able to do good and do well.
I think the idea of mobilizing resources of the people who have the ability to do well and do good instead of on other manners which might seem more altruistic, but at the same time could be slower and less impactful, is something that's very crucial to understand here. And I think more often than not, that is possibly the contention that most students and professionals face. And
you don't need to make the choice. So it would be my quick one is you can do well and do good. And that is the direction that we are seeing the world move, right? That we all need to actually do both. And that if our corporations aren't thinking about it in the right way, they're not going to survive either. So there's a lot of pressure to do things in the right way.
Not having to choose, I think, is probably what everybody needs to hear right now. But when you said that they wouldn't survive if they don't do good while they're doing well, I'm wondering if you can give us some more thoughts on that, because I think that is something that I'm very intrigued by myself.
Well, my personal perspective on as we see where the world is going, but BCG has created our total societal impact measure, and looking at organizations and what impact they're having on the world. And then we compare that to what financial impact they're having. And those that are doing the right thing in the right way do better. So they make more money for shareholders as well. So you can actually do business in an appropriate way, employing people, being good citizens and corporate citizens, and moving the needle in terms of your corporate social responsibility, as well as being profitable. And we are seeing investors say, you know what, I'm not going to invest in corporations who are not willing to take a stand and do the right thing. And we're going to see a divestiture in those organizations, and we're going to see those organizations not do as well. Also, we're talking to a lot of young people who will not work for corporations that aren't doing the right thing. And there's going to be a talent gap. People today, graduates today are demanding that their future employers are doing things the right way, which is great to see. And that's a power that the next generation has to choosing the right organizations. And there's going to be a war on talent, and talent's going to go to places where people feel they have purpose. They believe that the company is doing something that they believe in and that they trust, and at a place that they feel good about going to work every day on the work that they're doing.
I think our listeners will really appreciate that self-agency that they have in dictating how the larger institutional and corporations around them act, because it's very easy to feel helpless and feel like just a cog in this large machine. But I think we can all take to heart the fact that our individual decisions, which might seem very minuscule, are in turn having an impact on the way organizations function. So I think that is something that's very heartening to hear. Coming to all the things that you've worked in, specifically food security, racism, and mental health, I was hoping to dive deeper into food insecurity, which is something that I think this pandemic has really made us understand the true magnitude of. And it's not like it wasn't existing before, but we just realize it better now. What are the challenges you think do programs in the status quo face? And how do we go about creating sustainable solutions?
It's a great question. And food security is a pretty gnarly problem. So it's not a new problem, as you mentioned. 4.4 million people were experiencing food insecurity prior to the pandemic. Some of the estimates last year in May, I think the Canadian government did a survey and thought that it was up to about 5.5 million, which is just way too many people for a country like Canada to be experiencing food insecurity. And people don't have enough money to buy food is the end of the day. They're cutting meals. The parents are choosing not to eat as much as they would like to eat so that their kids have enough food. They're not getting the nutrients. 70% of Canadians are not getting the sufficient number of fruits and vegetables each day, which isn't that high. 5, like we should be able to get that in an average day. So yes, we are having a major issue in food security in Canada, and the systemic problems that are faced are pretty big. So the biggest one is money, hands down. If you do not have enough money to buy food, you do not have enough food. And so we can think about how do we get money into the hands of the people who need it most as the easiest solution, but not a very easy one at all. And then there's a bunch of other barriers, though, that we need to consider, and how people access food. Can you actually get to a store that sells food at a reasonable price? Where do you get your food? Is the food is it over expensive? Is it all manufactured food? Do you have any access to fresh fruits and vegetables? Are they at a reasonable cost? Can you afford it? And then how do we help people making sure that they understand budgeting and purchase power? And what do you, like, if you bought a big bag of potatoes at the beginning of the month, when you had that cash from your paycheck, that would actually last you significantly longer. That's a big investment to make up front. And then how do I cook a potato? There's also a knowledge gap, and especially with newcomers to Canada, where the food that they're typically used to cooking isn't readily available or is at inflated prices. There's a bunch of additional challenges. So we find that actually it's a lot more complicated than not having enough money, but that's the primary reason that people are food insecure, is they just don't have enough money. So how do we get food at reasonable cost for high nutrient, ideally low manufactured food into the hands of the people who need it most? There's a bunch of people working on it, but it's not sufficient yet. And we don't have a good answer on the horizon, but will require a lot of people working together to figure out.
So from everything that you've said so far, which has been very insightful, I think there's three key concerns when it comes to food insecurity, which is ability to pay, avenues to pay, and being able to do so in a sustainable fashion, while also having the peripheral resources to be able to sustain the ability to pay. And while you did mention that there are some programs doing this, I'm wondering if there are any novel solutions that stand out to you that you think have potential and should be explored further.
Great question. So there's lots of folks looking into what are these promising practices, proven practices, best practices? How can we think about them? So some, it's like, how do we avoid food waste and then get food waste back into the system? And if we think about it as food waste that we're recycling, it feels like I don't really want to eat food waste. But if we think about it as, how do we make sure that the food that exists is being used appropriately? There's an unlock there. So is there less food, the food that's about to expire in the grocery store? How do we get that into the hands of the people who are hungry today? How do we connect the dots of food that exists and hungry people and get that at scale? And so there's a couple of different organizations that are trying it, that are testing it. There's going to be a lot of opportunity here to innovate and to bring technology to these solutions, right? I have extra food. Oh, I need food. How do I connect the dots to get that efficiently and effectively distributed? So that's one. And then how do we reduce our reliance on patchwork solutions and look at long-term solutions? So food banks were created as a very short-term solution to an issue. They were supposed to be here for a year, maybe 3. It's been many decades that food banks have existed. Not everywhere in the world there are food banks. And we find that actually food insecurity in countries where there are no food banks sometimes is actually lower. But typically what happens here is that you say, oh, well, if they don't have enough food, they can just go to the food bank. And therefore it's a crutch. There is a terrible story I heard that I assume is correct about a large retailer in the United States that doesn't pay their staff sufficiently and posts a sign on the wall where the local food bank is. So while you're in your break room, you can the map to the food bank, because they're like, we don't need to pay you enough because you can go to the food bank. I don't know if this is a fact or a story, but pretty scary stuff of you can lean on this as a solution as opposed to taking accountability for your employees and making sure that they're earning a fair wage. So there's a lot of controversy in the food insecurity space, especially around big business and what role big business is playing. We have to think about it at that level, but also at the government level, at the individual location level. It is not going to be an easy solution, and the pandemic is not making it easier. So stuff that we've seen in the pandemic is that some of the crutches that have been used aren't available anymore. If your kids are getting free lunches at school and they're not going to school, they're not getting a lunch. And how are we thinking about that? And if you look at some of the innovative solutions that have been happening around the world about school buses that were dropping off, instead of picking up kids, they were dropping off lunches in communities, and that people were coming together and using the schools as a hub during the first couple months of the pandemic to actually distribute food. So there's been a lot of coming together on trying to solve this problem. I don't think we've solved it yet, but it's great when groups of all the different groups can come together and think about it. So when the government is willing to throw money at it, which they did in Canada, putting a lot of funds towards it, when they've got the Food Banks Canada who are consolidating and working with all the food banks across the country, we've got big corporations like Maple Leaf Foods who are committed to stopping food insecurity in Canada and are taking significant action, both financially as well as with investment and identifying promising practices in order to make change. And then all the nonprofits that are on the ground, they're doing this every day. So bringing all those groups together, I am confident we'll be able to solve it, but it's not a simple solution.
I'm sure. I mean, if it was simple, we probably had a solution already. When you were talking about those crushes, what really stood out to me is that you think that it's the people who are in need that would be dependent on these crutches, but it's almost as if organizations and institutions that are supposed to be supporting them instead use these crutches as an excuse for not doing more. But in times of crisis, you can't take those crutches away. So there has to be a balance between keeping those crutches in place while also ensuring that you don't have to hopefully need those crutches in the future. There's a lot of simultaneous games we have to play, which makes this a lot more confusing than it actually is.
Oh, definitely. And we can take that one step further in the confusing part of most social impact nonprofit organizations were created to put themselves out of business. And if you think about that as your ingoing raison d'etre, like I am going to create a nonprofit to get rid of a problem so that I no longer need to exist. It's a very different mental model than some of ours that are building on how do I get bigger and better and drive more people through my program, as opposed to stop the need for this program to exist. So something to think about as people are thinking about what their careers could be. Could you solve a solution? Could you actually solve a problem? Could you actually find a solution that eliminates the need for solutions? Be pretty cool.
And do you feel like that should be the end goal of somebody trying to get into this space?
I think it's a great goal. So some problems are never going to disappear. For instance, like literacy. You know what? We're going to have to teach kids how to read. Every kid's going to learn to read. You can eliminate falling behind in literacy, but you'll always have to be able to get kids reading. There's problems that are never going to disappear. There are other problems that some say you could actually eliminate food insecurity. You can eliminate the need for food banks if every Canadian has access to affordable and accessible food at a regular basis, and they have the means to purchase and to acquire that food. You wouldn't need food banks. That's unfortunately still quite far away in our current society, but it's a good aspiration. And I would love to have someone that's listening into this think about how can I solve that problem and own that one, and in my lifetime see the end of the need to provide emergency food, because there's enough other processes in place that no one's going to get to the point where there's no food in their cupboard. But it is a safety net we need still. So do not eliminate food banks. Do not stop funding food banks. Please still donate to food banks, especially during the pandemic. We are not there yet. But that is I think a reasonable aspiration.
It sounds very lackadaisical, but it makes so much sense that when you're trying to solve the biggest problems, your end goal is to not have to solve it anymore. And that puts you out of business. Some of them we might never be able to, but the only way we can get better at it is by trying to move in that direction, which I think is very important. Speaking of things that I think, unfortunately, will probably never disappear, the topic of racism comes up here, which is a much more pervasive issue in Canada than most people realize, which is something I realized when I came to Canada, because I had no idea about the history here. I'm very intrigued by what you think is the disconnect in the programming. Is there a lack of programs, or are programs acting inefficiently? Is it more than just programs that are needed?
So I think it's an interesting one, and I completely agree that there's a disconnect between the assumption that there's race. Like most Canadians actually do not believe we have racism in Canada. That's a first scary thought. So we did some interesting research, and we've been pulling a bunch of data on this topic. It's super important. 50% of Canadians believe the discrimination against Black people is no longer a problem. That was from a recent study. Yet 83% of Black Canadians say they believe that Blacks are being treated unfairly. So we have a disconnect on anti-Black racism, and unfortunately other racism as well, and we're starting to see some scary actions. We know that 50% of diverse Canadians see bias in their day-to-day work. It still exists. It exists and it still exists, and we have to acknowledge that there is bias in our systems and there is racism in Canada, which a lot of us are not really willing to or accept. So that's the first one, is accepting the facts and understanding the facts and getting knowledgeable on the facts. Do I think programs independently can solve this? No, I don't think it's a program kind of solution that would work, but we need to think about it. No action will not work. So we know that. And now the question is, what kind of action? What kind of overall action? And what has to happen in order to move the needle on this? It's got to be multifaceted. There's no one nonprofit that's going to come to Canada and solve racism. Unfortunately, I wish. But because when we started digging into this on the anti-Black racism piece, and we looked, and it's everywhere. From elementary schools and the way teachers are speaking to little kids, to the job market and how resumes are being screened, to how feedback is being given to our incarceration system and to our healthcare system. And even the racism in healthcare was shocking when we looked and dug into the data. So unfortunately, it's in every aspect of life in Canada. And to fix it, we're going to need to think about it in every aspect of life in Canada. It's going to take every Canadian to get behind this and understand it and take action. So I don't think there's a program that's going to solve it. I don't think that does not mean we shouldn't invest in programs that are trying, because we're going to need a lot of programs. We're going to need a lot of action. We're going to need employers at every level, nonprofit, for-profit, corporate, government. Every employer has got to think about their processes, their intake processes, their promotion processes, their ability to accept or not accept behavior at work, and what line they're going to draw, and creating open dialogue. If we think about some of the actions that are working, of how do we create an open dialogue where people feel they have the psychological safety to talk about the issues that are facing them, and making sure that their colleagues know that their behaviors are unacceptable when they're doing unacceptable behavior. So much bigger than programs.
It's a problem that's so entrenched in our institutions and just the way the world order around us functions in the status quo. What I'm really contending with myself all the time is, because it's such a multifaceted issue, as you mentioned, it can often feel like too big a problem to tackle at times, especially for our students and our listeners who are very passionate about this and want to approach this. How do you recommend we start?
So the best way to start is to start, and start anywhere, and is typically on any of these really hairy beasts of taking a step. So when we think about what actions can be taken, yes, there are many organizations that are taking action today. So that is one way. There are new nonprofits, there are new clubs and groups that are popping up that are taking action. Everyone can take action. So right now we're talking a lot about allyship and how important allyship is. So are you an ally? Of course, I think I'm an ally. And we've got a great podcast I'll plug that's coming out next week talking more about allyship. But the importance of it's not just about me thinking I'm an ally, but what active steps am I taking to be an ally? Am I telling everybody that I'm an ally? So I have to take action, and I have to be overt and to explain my action. I need to actually support the people, and I need to not just be passive. If I see something I don't think is fair, I need to stand up for it. I need to think about people who are different than me or maybe seeing negative action, and I need to push their ideas forward. If I'm in a room and seeing that there's a woman that keeps getting spoken over, I've got to stop the situation and say, whoa, this person is trying to get in. Let's give her a chance, or let's give him a chance. And let's make sure that we are creating opportunities for all different voices to be heard, and to be heard in an equal way. There's a ton of actions out there. There's a lot of lists, but from your individual actions, yes, take action, think about it, think about how you're supporting those around you, and then what systemic pieces, and then how do we challenge the system. And we've seen a lot of great progress in this very unfortunate year of bringing to light a lot of the stuff that's happening in the world. And until it's brought to light, some action's not being taken. So how do we try to avoid catastrophe before another, to a wake-up call to making sure that people understand that action is required?
Being cognizant of our privilege first, and the power that we hold, to then be able to use that power and privilege when we see these issues unraveling in front of us, rather than just being complacent and almost complicit at that point, is, I think, what we all should strive for. And we can, as you mentioned, in everyday life, because it's everywhere around us. There's so many opportunities to just a matter of us wanting to do something about it.
Completely. And it's like looking at your own actions. And it was very interesting insight for many people over the last year. And as we think about Black Lives Matter and think about different actions and listening, like it was incredible. We've had some amazing listening experiences where people have talked about their experience. And when you hear an experience that someone else has, and you're like, would I have been the person that might have done that microaggression without knowing it was a microaggression? The experience that some of our Black colleagues have of like they're going home to their own condo, holding their fob in their hand, and the person in front of them slams the door in their face and made an assumption, well, there's a Black man trying to follow me into my condo. There's no way he would live here. He must be a threat. No, he's not a threat. He's your neighbor, and he actually has been in the elevator with you 10 times in the last month. You should probably recognize he's holding a fob and he lives in your building. How do we get people to think, oh, wow, I am profiling without even knowing I'm profiling? And until I heard that story, wow, what an insight for me personally, and someone who I think is pretty open-minded. I think we've all had those insights over the last year because when people talk, when people share. So how do we create opportunities for people to talk and people to share? And how can we all stop taking microaggressions? How can we all be cognizant of our words and our behaviors and our thoughts? And how do we start to reprogram? And there's some great trainings out there, how we think about bias and anti-bias training. We all have biases. That's how our brains work. We have to rewire them to be thinking about them in the right way. And we need to make sure our society is doing that. So how do we do it at an individual level? How do we do it at a school level, at a business level, and then at a macro level? And again, we all need to work on this one. There's no silver bullet. There's no one nonprofit that's going to come in and just make our country not racist anymore. It doesn't work. It's continued action by everyone, and we can do it. That's the other piece, though. You said at the beginning, I don't think racism can disappear. I think racism can disappear. I'm an optimist on this one. I think with the right influence and the right commitment and the right frame of mind, we can really do a big push here to make things much better for many people.
As a foolishly optimistic person, I'm sincerely hoping that is the case, and I'm rooting for that to be the case. And
I didn't give you a time frame, so
well, that really is the trick. Being willing to accept that even though we might think we're doing enough, we're not doing enough.
Yeah.
And there is room for improvement, and we always need to be improving on this front is something that we all need to be more mindful of, and being willing to entertain that thought, because that is tough, especially when you think you're doing something, but you're not doing enough of it. And especially because racism, like a lot of our problems around us right now, you can't always see it because it's so much in your mind. The biases that you were talking about. And that's what makes this tougher, which is why we need action to be motivated from within rather than from the outside. But speaking of matters like that, I think if there's one thing this pandemic has accentuated more than anything else, it is the acute mental health crisis that we're all going through right now, every single moment on a global scale. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can go about mitigating this disaster.
This is a big, I don't know, this one's a really, really hard and gnarly subject. And we look at what has been happening in terms of mental health. And yes, everyone on the planet is experiencing repercussions of this pandemic, right? This is so far reaching, and everyone is having a different experience, but not many great experiences. Some people might be, but most people not. And the mental health load on everyone is pretty high. We've seen it across the board, and we see it in our children. We see it in our teens, our students, our workers, our moms, the moms out there who are trying to work and care and be an educator as well. Study that we recently did showed that an extra 20 hours of work was the average female caregiver has since the pandemic. And so they used to have about 20 hours of household work, and now an extra 20 hours of household work. So they're working 2 full-time jobs if they're working a full-time job plus the caregiver job in an average week. So it's high. It's a huge mental burden. It's a huge physical burden. And then we think about the mental health of everyone is really struggling. And we think about our youngest and the impact that has pretty stark. One positive is a lot of the great mental health programs that were operating before have been able to pivot and offer remote, which is one thing that I'm proud of. I sit on a nonprofit board of a children's mental health organization. We were able to pivot and we were able to provide remote services and seeing significant impact and significant positive impact for the young people that we're able to support. That I think would be a benefit. And then we're learning that virtual care can work, which is the other piece. And virtual mental health care, still pretty new field, but seems to be not nearly as effective, or maybe as nearly effective. It is effective though. However, on the scale of effectiveness and how long term we'll have to see. But that is one benefit, as we can see that remote can happen. But it is a tough time. It's a tough time for everybody, and having mental health resources is critical at this point in time. I don't know if I can dig into how or what, but I would say that this is a place that we're going to continue to need to invest. We are also fortunate on this one that there's been an increase in awareness of mental health in recent years. If we were 10, 15 years ago where it was pretty taboo to talk about mental health, and it wasn't something that's front and center, it wasn't a benefit that employers were thinking about offering their staff, it wasn't something that people talked about in school. And if you're seeing a psychologist, you must have problems. I think we've moved really far from that. So I will make sure that quote is not taken out of context, because today I think it's very normal for people to seek support for mental health, and they should. And everybody listening, if you don't have support for mental health, there are many free as well as probably school resources available to you, because this is a tough time. It's a tough time for everybody. And the things that give most of us energy are just not there. It's a place that we are going to need to continue to invest. We've seen some investments happening at the global level, but this is going to be something that's not going away anytime soon.
I think being in these times, there has been more than ever before a surge of empathy in this regard, because mental health was a problem before as well, but because not everybody was experiencing it because of a global commonality, a lot of times we unfortunately discounted the impacts of it. But now, because we're all going through it, there's an empathy that's strives from it, which I think is a silver lining and provides us an opportunity to be more proactive about this. The thing with virtual care, as you mentioned, it's a really exciting field, which we probably would not have explored as much if we weren't forced to. Virtual care and everything of that regard requires a certain peripheral support around it that certain developing countries and other certain communities don't always have access to. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we can mitigate that.
That's a great point. The digital divide has been impacting us far more during a global pandemic than before. So we think about it within societies as well as between societies. It's so high. So we know that folks who don't have access to reliable internet and reliable devices are being left behind at a much faster rate than ever before. And you look at that, and that's happening in North America. It's happening to our lowest income kids in our school systems, in our publicly funded, well-funded Canadian school systems. It's happening. And then if we think about, if you look at the world as a whole, just whole groups of people being left behind. It's easy for us to have this conversation currently using our fairly reliable internet, my laptop, my technology that exists, because I'm very fortunate. And the number of times that I've thought during this pandemic, wow, I am so privileged. I have a warm house. My kids are safe. I have food in my fridge. I have access to technology. I can do my job from my home. That is not a privilege that most people have. That is not a privilege that most people in Canada have, and it's not a privilege most people around the world have. So it is definitely time to take stock of that. And as we think about the digital divide and the impact on mental health, the impact on education, literacy rate, and employability, and then therefore food insecurity, and going back to where we started this conversation, it is a huge issue. I'm just hopeful this vaccine rollout will be able to get this curve completely flattened, and we'll be able to return to a place where people can go in person to receive the systems and the stuff they need. That being said, to your point on how has virtual changed, it has changed for the better, and it will enable us to be able to do more. So be that locally, be that globally, having been able to create systems that provide for virtual anything will be a huge benefit. And if we think about virtual healthcare, virtual mental health, there will be a big benefit to our leap in terms of technological benefit. There will be a few benefits coming out of this pandemic, definitely not a lot of benefits, but a few.
Generally when we talk about going back to normal, I don't personally believe that going back to normal is a thing, because that discounts our lived experiences in these times. But one thing that I think I'm personally very concerned about, because of this very popularized notion, is us giving up the learnings of these times and the realizations that we've had in these times. And that transcends to the topic of mental health as well. Are you hopeful or optimistic about us sustaining this empathy that we've generated in these times? And is there something we can do to be more proactive about sustaining it?
I'm an optimist. So yes, we'll sustain the empathy, but how is a great question. And it's a worthwhile one for us all to consider, right? Is what from this pandemic are we going to block out and never want to remember? And what are those lessons that we're going to take with us and continue to think about? And I know that the ability for us to connect and be effective and efficient from a virtual environment will stay. And the development of virtual care, virtual connections will continue. At the rates they're currently at? No, but at a rate, yes. The empathy, I should hope so. I'll join you on the optimist train on this one and say yes, but we'll have to figure out how. How are we going to encourage that? And how can we not forget the lessons that we've learned through this very strange time?
We all could use a little bit more optimism. And I think being more optimistic about it encourages you to do something, because if you're not optimistic, you wouldn't even try. I personally believe that having those dialogues that you were talking about, those open, honest, candid dialogues, and sustaining those dialogues is crucial to sustaining that empathy. Because only when you can understand the lived experiences of people other than you can you try and relate to them and understand where exactly you and your experiences lie in that entire spectrum of the human experience. You were talking about being able to function virtually and connect and work and collaborate with people. You have worked with such a wide variety of people on such a wide variety of projects. I'm wondering if you have any ideas or experiences that you can share about approaching this wide variety of issues under your belt, and not being an expert in any one of them, but being this overarching head of sorts in everything.
Well, it's kind of fun would be the answer there of how do you think about playing in a couple different fields. And it's where I believe the importance of bringing different ideas to the table comes. And if we think back to consulting, I think it was the most improbable business solution of let's bring in really smart people who know nothing about a topic and get them up to speed quickly, and then they're going to give advice. Well, yes, this is how it works in consulting of like you come in with a base knowledge, you then dive deep into a topic, get to know it really well and really understand the intricacies, and then be able to elevate and think about how you can make it better. It also comes with asking questions. And how can you go into a situation and see what's happening and say, why? Why are you doing it that way? And the answer is typically, we've been doing it this way for 50 years. I'm like, does that mean it's the right way? And how do you do that to someone that's been doing their job the same way for 50 years? They're doing their job the same way for 50 years. It's got to be a better way, right? Nothing has stayed the same in the last 50 years. So of course there's a new way to do it. So actually being able to come in with a fresh perspective and ask difficult questions can completely change the outcome. I think that actually coming into industries and coming into different sectors in the nonprofit space and bringing those learnings from elsewhere and bringing the business background can drive significant impact. And actually asking those questions of why can't we do this virtually? Or what are the constraints around? Or have you thought about trying this? Or how is that food going to get there? Aren't there trucks that are already driving across the country empty? There are lots of good questions you can start to ask when you bring a fresh perspective, when you bring a different approach. And so that's why the importance of actually having a diverse skill set, a diverse group of people at the table and coming from different backgrounds is critical. We think a lot about how we staff our teams when we are hiring and I would encourage everyone to think about diverse teams. And we're not talking about diversity just in terms of ethnic or racial or sexual orientation or gender or any of these, but let's think about diversity of thought and all those other voices, because diverse experiences is critical. What do you bring to the table? And everyone brings something to the table. Everyone brings their own personal experiences, their own personal anecdotes, what they've seen, what they've experienced, what they've learned, what they've learned in school, how they've learned in school to the table. And that diversity of upbringing of everything brings the best solutions. So You can't get to the best solutions if we all come from the same spot. And that's why actually having external people think about big problems is critical to drive change. Yes, I think that you can bring a lot from an outsider's perspective to any of these problems. And I think that all of the students listening should think about that. You all have very interesting experiences and backgrounds and perspectives and can ask great questions. And that's what we'll need to come out of this pandemic, and also to think about the next generation and what we can do and the impact we can have is pretty unlimited if you're asking the right questions.
What I find funny about that is, as an outsider, you're not very well versed with the conventions of the playground, which is why you don't know what's taboo and not taboo. So you're a lot more open to asking questions that otherwise would cross your mind, but you wouldn't dare to ask it. Funny, but at the same time, it's very profound to be willing to ask the tough questions just because you're curious to know the answers. And it has to come, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, not from a place of skepticism, but rather from a place of curiosity.
For sure. Exactly. If you come with the skepticism, I don't think that's going to work. You're not going to build many bridges. So it's like, this is a very interesting way. Is this the way you've always done it? Why do you do it this way? I am trying to understand the best ways to do it. Have you seen anyone else do it a different way? Why would they do it that way? But you can come with that curiosity and that naivete, right? This looks a little bit different than other industries I've been in. Tell me about your industry. Tell me about why and how and where this has come from. And if you come with curiosity and not with skepticism, you can build those relationships that are longstanding and also drive that impact.
I think we all need a lot more curiosity in our lives and less skepticism and more optimism. Coming to the point of diversity, one thing that I find myself always contending with is the notion of diversity for the sake of diversity, as you mentioned yourself, tokenistic diversity. And it's very easy to fall into that trap of being diverse just to tick some boxes. How do you go about creating this diverse team that is diverse in thought, while at the same time not creating an eventual echo chamber? Eventually, something will become an echo chamber if you're there long enough. How do you constantly ensure that you're not letting it become an echo chamber?
So I think that we need to think about diversity of thought, and that to get the most and to get the best, we need to think outside of the ordinary. So how do we make sure that we're not always doing the same thing? Like, you take school, for example, if you're working only with engineers all the time, it's always engineers, always engineers, always engineers. And then you get put on a team and you've got a political science person on the team and they're like, why are you so into that? What about this? And they're like, oh, actually, we needed to bring our head out of whatever topic we were in. You're going to see a better answer. So how do you actually think about structuring diversity to include diversity of thought? Not for the sake of diversity, but for the sake of the best answer. And we have found research hands down says diverse teams come up with better answers. They also can come up with slower answers, but better answers. So it depends on what if you want to get there fast, go alone. If you want to get there further, go as a team, right? Like, how do we actually think about getting to the best answer? And getting to the best answer is bringing the most and the best heads to the table. So tokenism is not the answer. There's a time and place for it. I will buffer there a little bit based on some of the additional research I've seen, that if you aren't creating spaces at the table for everyone, we can't get a space at the table. So it's so important to ensure there's a space at the table for everyone. Once you're at the table, we need to make sure we have a diverse set of experiences, a diverse set of perspectives, and that everyone's voice can be heard. And that's how we'll get to the best answers. Diversity of thought.
That makes a lot of sense. And what I found really profound is you have to give people a seat at the table for them to be capable of bringing something of value to the table. And everybody has something to bring of value, but it's just them being able to do that in a manner that is meaningful. And that comes with having a seat at the table and realizing that you can bring something of value.
So critical. You have to be at the table and you have to have a voice. We had to create space for everyone to have a voice at the table once they're there.
This notion of everybody having something of value to add is what we really strive to emphasize with this podcast, and also generally at Global Spark, is not everybody has to be an engineer or a business student or somebody who can solve partial differential equations. to solve the world's biggest problems. We all have something of value to add. I hope that our listeners pay attention to this. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And as we wrap here, I was wondering if you have any thoughts or insights on where you see the work of social impact in the realm of business progressing in the future. What do you reckon the future holds?
The convergence of business and social impact is already upon us, and it will continue. So I would say that a long time ago, we thought, okay, there's a role for business, there's a role for government, there's a role for nonprofits, and those don't intersperse. That is not the world that we're living in now, and it's not the world we're going to live in. Business will be a critical driver to the future of driving change and to doing things in the right way and to drive society forward. If we think about climate change, if we think about diversity, we think about employment, we think about food insecurity comes from having a job. So how do we solve all of these problems? It can't be one silo alone. It cannot be just nonprofits driving to do this and asking people for money to do it. It can't just be social enterprises, although they play a very important role of finding a funding mechanism in order to drive change. It actually needs to be all of the players at the table taking a stance, lock arm, and saying this is important. And that's the world that we're going to see the change come through. And it's amazing to see how business has embraced the importance of doing what's right, and how corporate social responsibility has moved from being, oh yeah, we should hire someone in that pillar, and then maybe I'll talk to them once a year and they can write a little mini report, to being at the table where decisions are being made. And we see that decisions are being made with the chief sustainability officer, with the head of corporate social responsibility, with the people team chair, who's thinking not just about how do we get the most out of each person, but how do we do that in a way that actually enables a diverse workforce that's bringing the right answers to the table, because we know the diverse answers are going to be the better answer. It will drive business doing what's right. So we are going to see a big convergence of the social impact sector with the corporate sector, and roles that are going to exist in the business sector that are doing right. So, which is very exciting. It's a very exciting time. We're seeing investors take significant action already. We're seeing a lot of action happening. And I'm very optimistic that when we bring all of these minds and people are focused on doing what's right, we are going to see significant benefit for everyone. That doesn't discount anyone's responsibility. We still need everybody, and everyone needs to keep moving that direction. What's pretty exciting for folks that are entering the workforce is that you can do it. You can, I can't say all, you can't do it all, but you can find a role in business that has purpose. You can find a role in a nonprofit that should have sustainability attached to it. You can find a role in government that drives change. There should be a convergence to finding opportunities that will make this world better, because we're going to need people in all those sectors. It's not going to be a singular answer that's going to solve the world's problems. I'm confident that if we all put our heads together, we'll be able to make significant impact here.
Absolutely. Our listeners, they have such wide and various backgrounds. They're entrepreneurs, social change makers, engineers, business professionals, but all in all forward-thinking students that are looking for ways to improve the world around them through interdisciplinary collaboration and innovation. So your words are actually very heartening in that respect, that we all have something we can bring to the table. And it's just a matter of finding what we want to bring to the table, because we have something to bring to the table. Is there any particular area that you're particularly excited about or hope is explored more in your work? That's
a hard decision. So education is always what's brought me the most passion, because I feel that if we can get the next generation on track, we can sustain any of these kinds of impacts. And so I would say that as we think about what are we doing to support the next generation, and what is the role we're doing right now for our students, and then also for that next generation of how are we driving literacy? We know literacy is the most important thing for having a career in academia and driving a well-paying job in society. How do we then foster that early on? So I would say we each have our passion. I think global health right now is a critical element. And as we think about what can we do in that space, as we think about climate change, there's no time like now or 10 years ago to think about climate change and what actions that we're taking on the individual as a business, as a corporate, as a global, as entities, stop climate change. And it's the planet for the future. So yes, there are many topics. There are many things that inspire. I think though, if we think about your listeners, is what inspires you? What gets you jazzed up? What gets you excited? What is that issue or that topic that you're like, wow? And then even if it's not that wow topic right now, you might turn it into. I knew nothing about food insecurities before I started diving into it. And it is such a critical element to the future of society. And if we think back to the future generation, guess what? Kids who have an empty tummy do not learn to read nearly as fast as kids who are well fed. So they're all intertwined, and you have to be in school, and you can't be homesick if you want to get educated. So that they all come together. And as we're thinking about the global issues and the global topics, they're all intertwined. They're all important. But thinking about the future, and I think that we can be optimistic that there are opportunities. But as we mentioned, we need to put all the brain power together to drive change.
Them all being intertwined means that starting somewhere helps, because eventually it will lead you to affecting all of them in some regard or the other. But it's just a matter of finding one that you're most inspired by, and then just letting the path lead you wherever it takes you.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point on the inspiration. So I would say, as people think about their careers and about what they want to do, you want to be inspired. You want to find your purpose. You want to get up in the morning and say, you know what? I'm making the world better, or I'm doing good, or I'm happy with what I'm doing, or I'm making millions of dollars, whatever gets you going. But you need to have a purpose. You need to have a reason for what you do. And what that reason is, it's going to lie somewhere within you, and it can be anything, but have a reason, right? As you're thinking about your career, as you're thinking about what change and what impact you're going to have in the world, what is your purpose? What is your reason? Why do you do what you do? Is it going to make you or your family or yourself or society or the next generation or the world a better place?
One of my favorite public speakers, Simon Sinek, always says that if you have a why, you can sustain any how and any what. Just finding that why within us is something that we all need to do, and it's hard. It's undeniably hard, which is why we often don't ask ourselves that question, but we need to start with why.
That's so important. How do you think about the why? What is it? Why do you do what you do?
If we all did that, the world around us would be a much better place to live in. Lesser unfed tummies.
Exactly.
Well, Kate, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time out and talking to us today. I'm sure our listeners would sincerely appreciate and gain value from everything that we've talked about so far.
Excellent. Well, it's been a pleasure, and I wish everyone the best of luck. The work that's being done and the passion that you are all bringing is critical, and we need that next generation of leaders to step up and to step together and to drive change. I'm inspired by this group. I'm inspired by the students that are out there, and I am optimistic that we will see some amazing things coming forward. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
And that is a wrap on this episode. We shall be back soon with a different guest and exploring a new avenue in the world of social impact, problem solving, and multidisciplinary collaboration. But don't you worry about missing out. We will CC you on it. The CC World podcast is produced and edited by Maurice Huang and Atharva Agrawal. Content creation is undertaken by Huwen Zhang, Logan Keeler, and Annie Zhu. And the music is created by Gent Zapluja. You can find more CC World episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Remember to follow us on social media at Global Spark to get updates on future events and content. And visit our website at globalspark.world for more information. Once again, thanks for listening to CC World, and we'll see you on the next episode.